Hoyle exposes the dangerous gap between trained policing and how ICE is being deployed right now.
Now I'd like to go to Representative Val Hoyle from the state of Oregon.
I've spoken to many members and leaders in municipal law enforcement. I've spoken to many members and leaders in municipal law enforcement, and they're watching what's happening in Minnesota, and they're extremely concerned about what's going to happen in their communities. Now, I don't represent Portland, Oregon, but it's clearly high on the list of targets of for the Trump administration. And we have 9 federally recognized tribes that are watching what is happening with the Oglala Sioux and are wondering if they're next. In my district, DHS is trying to take over our Coast Guard facility that's critical for ocean rescues to build an ICE facility in a community where immigrants are working the most difficult jobs in commercial fishing, fish processing, agriculture, and protecting us from wildfire. Now, Chief McCarthy, we know that law enforcement has done the extremely hard work of building trust with the civilian population. And for any community to respect the authority of law enforcement, they have to believe that officers are operating in their best interest and respecting the rule of law. Stephen Miller has said ICE agents have absolute immunity with no qualifications, that habeas corpus can be suspended at the time of an invasion, and they're looking at that. The president has brought up invoking the Insurrection Act in cities that didn't vote for him and against communities that stand up against unconstitutional and illegal actions of ICE. Kristi Noem accused Renee Good of being a domestic terrorist before even looking at the facts. We have ICE agents that have between 4 weeks of online training and maximum 8 weeks of in-person training with limited background checks being thrown into highly charged situations, with the administration egging on aggressive actions and spreading disinformation instead of working to de-escalate what is clearly putting our communities and our local law enforcement in danger. So, Chief McCarthy, could you briefly tell us what kind of training and experience do your local law enforcement officers have, and what does an investigation look like after an officer-involved shooting? Because I do not think there's any comparison to what has happened with the Renee Good shooting.
Thank you, ma'am, for that question. So in Minnesota, the minimum to be a police officer is you have to have a 2-year degree in law enforcement and criminal justice, or a 4-year degree in anything. Once you've obtained that degree, we go through a skills-based program that is supervised by the state, and that's anywhere from 3 to 6 months. Then you are eligible to be licensed. Once you are eligible to be licensed, you can then apply at police departments who do a rigorous psychological and background check. Once that is done and you are hired, you then go through a training period, which again is another anywhere from 3 to 6 months, with a minimum of 1 year probationary period. As far as after a use of force, an officer-involved shooting, it is very, very important that we do not comment, we do not guess as far as a justification or not a justification. You never want to color an investigation, as difficult as it is to not react to what you see. Professionally, it is very, very important that you don't give an indication if something is justified or not justified until all of the facts are brought in. It's very thorough, and only then does that legal determination get made at the end of a thorough investigation.
All right, thank you very much. Know that we're standing with you, and the Trump administration's use of force was meant to get people to back down, and the longer that you can stand up with our support, the better chance we have of making sure that this stops. We stop this in its tracks. Thank you all for your words.
Thank you, Representative Hoyle. I'd now like to recognize.
What unfolds in this exchange is not just a policy disagreement. It's a warning about how power, fear, and misinformation can collide in ways that endanger communities and erode trust in institutions that are supposed to protect people. Representative Val Hoyle isn't raising abstract concerns. She is grounding this moment in lived reality. Cities watching what's happening in Minnesota and wondering if they're next. Tribal nations fearing federal overreach, and working-class immigrant communities suddenly treated as threats rather than neighbors. One of the most important things Hoyle does here is slow the conversation down and force a comparison that many people outside law enforcement never get to see. She contrasts professional, locally accountable policing with what is being asked of ICE under this administration. Local officers, as the Minnesota police chief explains, undergo years of education, months of supervised training, psychological evaluations, deep background checks, and probationary periods. And when an officer is involved in a shooting, there is a deliberate process designed to avoid rushing to judgment, contaminating evidence, or inflaming public tensions before the facts are known. That's the standard, and it matters because trust between law enforcement and the community doesn't happen by accident. It's built slowly through accountability, restraint, and transparency. Hoyle then puts that standard next to what she describes happening with ICE. Agents with weeks of online training, limited background checks, and minimal preparation are being deployed into highly charged environments. At the same time, political leaders are publicly declaring that these agents should have absolute immunity, floating the suspension of habeas corpus, and openly discussing the use of extraordinary powers like the Insurrection Act against communities that dissent. That combination, undertrained enforcement paired with inflammatory rhetoric from the top, is not accidental escalation, it is a recipe for chaos. The accusation that DHS Secretary Kristi Noem labeled Renee Good a domestic terrorist before the facts were established is central to this moment. Hoyle is pointing out something deeper than a single statement. When leaders rush to criminalize or dehumanize people before investigations are complete, they don't just prejudice outcomes, they signal to agents on the ground that aggression will be excused and restraint is optional. That doesn't just put civilians at risk, it puts local law enforcement in danger too, because it undermines the trust they rely on to keep communities safe. There's also a constitutional lesson here that viewers should not miss. Habeas corpus, due process, and the presumption of innocence are not technicalities. They exist precisely for moments like this, when fear and political pressure tempt leaders to bypass safeguards. When federal officials talk casually about suspending rights or granting blanket immunity, they are not just testing policy limits, they are testing how much erosion the public will tolerate. Hoyle's final point is perhaps the most human. She frames this not as an abstract power struggle, but as a choice: escalation or de-escalation, accountability or impunity, truth or disinformation. She reminds local officials that standing firm with public support is how abuse of power is stopped, not through silence or fear, but through collective refusal to normalize it. This exchange teaches viewers something crucial. Democracy doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes when extraordinary measures become routine, when accusations replace evidence, and when force is used to intimidate rather than protect. Understanding that process is the first step in resisting it. At Left Lens, this is why we take the time to break moments like this down, to move past the sound bites and help you understand what's at stake beneath the surface. If you value informed analysis, accountability, and human-centered coverage, support this work by sharing the video, subscribing to Left Lens, and staying engaged. The more people understand how power is being used, the harder it becomes to misuse it.